I arrived at the party with my wife, and her ex-husband took her from me in front of everyone, without any embarrassment, as if she had never belonged to me, as if all our years together, our trips, our nights, our home, were just a shadow in front of that moment in which she chose him, there, in front of me. And when I went to them, with my heart bleeding inside my chest, I looked at her with eyes full of everything she killed inside me and said, "Why did you decide to go with this guy? You will now live with him, and no longer with me. It's all over between us," and I divorced her right there, in that crowded room, in front of her wide, gaping eyes. The band stopped playing, the waiter carrying the champagne tray froze in the middle of the room, the women whispered among themselves and the men just looked at me with that mute look of someone who knew but didn't dare say. That night, I didn't just lose a wife. I lost my peace, my ground, my identity. But what no one there knew, not even her, was that betrayal would only be the beginning of a chain of events that no one could predict. Because, until then, I believed that betrayal was the lowest point a human being could suffer. Public humiliation, abandonment, open exchange, as if love were an item on the shelf. But what would come later, when the glow of that recycled passion faded, would be the real punishment. And this punishment, which it was not I who inflicted, but life, fell upon her with the weight of a cruel and deserved fate. She left with him as if she believed she was reliving an old love, as if she were returning to the point where she once believed she was happy. Perhaps driven by distorted memories or by the unresolved neediness that has grown between our four walls in recent months. And as much as it hurt, as much as it burned to see my wife leaving everything we built behind, I didn't make a fuss. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I gave her the freedom she thought she was conquering, but which, in reality, was the beginning of the most bitter prison anyone can experience. What no one noticed that night was his haste. The barely disguised nervousness. Sweat running down the side of my face, even under the room's freezing air conditioning. He didn't take his eyes off her, but not with tenderness, but with an unsettling impatience. Like someone holding an essential piece of a plan that needs to be completed before time runs out. She was dazzled, deluded, trapped in a reverie that seemed romantic, but was anything but love. What she didn't know, and what she would discover too late, was that she wasn't the only piece in that game, and that the board had already been set up long before that night happened. When she left me with the cruelest void, one in which pain is not yet hate, but is also no longer love. It's just the echo of everything that was thrown away. But I believed that would be the end. I collected myself, walked away, swallowed the shame like a silent poison and accepted reality. Or at least I tried. Until the rumors started to arrive. Nothing solid, just fragments of conversations, common whispers between acquaintances, looks that avoided mine when I asked about her. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just the betrayal. That was what came next. She went into business with him. They used the money she took from our divorce settlement, added to his supposed capital, money that, according to her, would come from an inheritance, from a successful investment, from promises he made under sheets still warm from a lying passion. She believed. Bet. And not only that, he bet everything. The apartment he inherited from his mother, the car, the life insurance he redeemed ahead of time. He even gambled on his dignity. And me? I just watched from afar, silently, until the day the bomb went off. He disappeared. Disappeared like smoke. Without leaving a trace. Without giving explanations. The frozen accounts, the forged documents, the blank promissory notes, all in her name. All. The debt was hers. The hit had been perfect. And the lover, the hero of the past who promised to rescue lost love, was nothing more than a luxury emotional conman, but not just any scammer. He didn't just want money. He wanted to see it destroyed. Because there was something between them from the past that no one ever knew. An old pain. A grudge camouflaged under kisses and sweet words. A wound he never forgave. And she, blinded by the illusion of a love that was never real, believed she was going back to the beginning. But in fact, it was falling straight to the end. It's not just about carnal betrayal. What hurts the most is realizing that your entire story, all the years, all the nights you laid down next to someone and swore there was true love there, were convenient lies. That the hugs were calculations. That the looks were distractions. That every gesture of affection was just an attempt to convince himself of something that was never genuine. And the cruelest thing, she blamed me. Because I didn't realize it before, because I wasn't everything she imagined, because I got older, because I became predictable. As if loyalty were synonymous with boredom, as if stability were punishment. Months later, I found her at the bank, standing, arguing with the manager. The paler skin, the disheveled hair, the swollen eyes. She spoke loudly, gestured, desperately. I tried to go unnoticed, but she saw me. And the look she gave me, that look, was a mixture of pain, shame and pleading. As if asking for help with his eyes, but without the courage to open his mouth. And I understood right there, in that second, that there was no going back. For her. For me. For us. But what she never knew was that after the storm of public humiliation, after the emotional shipwreck of a love that drowned in silence, something inside me began to be reborn. And that was when, in an unlikely place, in a small cafe, at random, my path crossed with someone who knew nothing about my story, but looked at me as if he could see through me. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to be seen again. However, what still keeps me up at night is not betrayal. It's not the fall. That's what I discovered years later about the real reason her ex-husband came back. A truth hidden under lock and key, buried in a past that she tried to erase. And when I found out, everything changed. What seemed like just an emotional mistake was part of something bigger. Something that involved all of us. Something that might explain why, to this day, when I close my eyes, I still hear her question echoing like a poisoned whisper, would you still love me, if you knew what I did? But what did she do? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, and will never support, any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but based on real situations that show how devastating the choice to cheat can be. Our objective is clear, show the consequences of infidelity and how it can ruin lives, destroy homes and leave deep scars on the soul. Get ready. What you will hear now is a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Good story. In one of the city's most elegant neighborhoods, where the wide sidewalks were framed by centuries-old trees and the buildings had flowery balconies like watercolor paintings, there lived a couple who, to everyone's eyes, seemed the exact picture of stability and harmony. Daniel and Laura were the kind of couple that provokes silent smiles at family dinners and envious comments at wedding parties. Married for 6 years, together for almost a decade, they had the kind of relationship that many wanted, calm, functional, built on solid foundations of respect, mutual admiration and a carefully designed routine to accommodate love alongside adult responsibilities. They weren't perfect, of course, and perhaps they didn't even aspire to be, but their imperfections seemed to fit comfortably within what is expected of a life together. He was a respected architect, owner of a medium-sized firm that had been growing steadily, and she was a marketing manager at a cosmetics company, with a creative eye and a keen sensitivity to reading people and situations. Laura had a captivating presence, a serene smile that was calming, a sweet, firm voice that never went unnoticed. Her charm didn't come from her obvious beauty, although she was beautiful in a natural way, but from the confidence with which she occupied spaces, the way she listened with genuine interest, as if the world really slowed down when someone talked to her. Daniel, on the other hand, was more reserved, methodical, but surprisingly fun at the right times. He was the type of man who always seemed to have everything under control, even in the most chaotic moments, and his silence was almost always read as a sign of wisdom, not coldness. In fact, he loved silently, deeply. His love for Laura wasn't loud, he didn't make passionate speeches or manifest itself with grand public gestures, but it lived in the details, in the coffee prepared before she woke up, in the notes hidden between the pages of the books she read, in the almost invisible care of keeping her world in order. They shared a large apartment, on the 4th floor of an old, renovated building, where everything reflected their personality. Books stacked in strategic corners, modern paintings hanging next to black and white photographs from past trips, plants spread out in harmony. They had no children, yet, and the decision to postpone this step came more from prudence than from doubts. They both wanted it, but they wanted to be ready. They wanted the world they built to be safe enough to welcome new life. And, at that moment, they believed they were on the right path. Their routine was calm, balanced, and although the passion of the first years had been replaced by a more serene coexistence, there was no coldness between them. There was comfort. A silent complicity that manifested itself in the way one completed the other's sentence, in the way they understood each other with a look, how they laughed at the same absurdities and knew exactly when the other needed silence or presence. During the week, the days were taken up by meetings, deadlines, spreadsheets, projects. At night, simple dinners, glasses of wine, series interrupted by long conversations, laughter and, sometimes, complete silence. On the weekends, they explored the city, visited galleries, new restaurants, or simply spent hours on the balcony, observing life from above. They were happy, or at least they believed they were. They didn't demand the intensity they used to, but they still desired each other, they still sought each other's touch before going to sleep. There was sex, there was affection, there was the feeling that there was still time for everything they hadn't done. Daniel deeply admired Laura's intelligence. She used to tell her friends that, in addition to being beautiful, she was sagacious, that she saw people beyond their masks, that she had an almost supernatural intuition. And, in fact, Laura was the type to notice details, a subtle change in tone, a shift in gaze, the hesitation in a word. Interestingly, it was precisely this perception that, from time to time, made her dive into silent reflections, especially about herself. Sometimes, he wondered if the love he experienced was real love or just the result of careful construction, of a planned, functional life, too stable for the chaos he occasionally felt within himself. I didn't say that to Daniel. Maybe out of fear of hurting him. Perhaps for fear of discovering that there was more truth to that doubt than she would like to admit. But she was still there, present, dedicated, committed to what they had built. They were very loved among their friends. They had a close and constant circle, and a very active social life. They attended dinners, birthdays, launches, corporate events and get-togethers. Most of the time, they were seen as an example of a couple, serene, successful, balanced. He always had his hand on her back, in a protective gesture, and she always had a firm gaze, proudly beside him. They participated in each other's decisions, discussed business, career advice, large purchases, investments. There was a solid respect between the two, built over the years. And this solid foundation was the structure on which they both leaned on, even when the passion no longer burned like it used to. There was, however, a constant presence in Laura's life that, although discreet, never failed to be noticed by Daniel, Thomas, her ex-husband. A name that came up from time to time in unpretentious conversations, in random mentions, in situations that always seemed to coincide with new news in her life. Thomas was part of Laura's past, yes, but it was a past that seemed, at certain moments, not to be completely buried. Daniel, in turn, never expressed jealousy. He trusted her, he trusted the story they had built together. And, more than anything, I trusted the maturity I believed I had in separating facts from feelings, reasons for insecurities. I preferred to silence the inner voice that, from time to time, questioned this trust. However, the reunion between them, Laura and Thomas, took place under perfectly casual circumstances. He had returned to the city after years away, and reappeared at an art exhibition that Laura frequently attended. The meeting was brief, polite, but it left her with a feeling of uneasiness that was difficult to explain. There was no inappropriate touching, no overt flirting. Just that nagging feeling that something inside her had moved. She felt strange. Guilty even without having done anything. Upon arriving home, Daniel asked how the exhibition had been, and she told him everything, naturally, as she always did. Thomas's name escaped among other words, as if it were just one of so many pieces of information shared that day. Daniel just nodded, said, "Ah, how curious," and continued the conversation. But inside him, something ignited. A warning, perhaps. A feeling I couldn't name. And that he decided to ignore. Days passed and the routine continued. Dinners, laughter, silence. But Laura sometimes seemed too absorbed. And Daniel, even though he noticed, decided to respect her space. They both had moments like that. It wasn't uncommon for one of them to get too immersed in their work or their own worries. It was part of the balance. It was part of trusting. And Daniel trusted. He loved her with that kind of mature love that chooses to remain even when the newness is no longer there. Who believes in construction, in the path, in partnership. Who closes his eyes to uncertainties because he believes that the fundamentals are strong enough to sustain any shock. And Laura, in turn, tried to suppress the confusion she felt. It wasn't about love or lack of love. It wasn't desire, nor nostalgia. It was something deeper, more disconcerting. A feeling that there was a sleeping version of herself, suffocated by a life that was too good to question. As if feeling grateful for the life she had kept her from recognizing that there were parts of herself that weren't entirely alive. But she followed. He used to smile. I lived my life alongside Daniel, planning vacations, Sunday lunches, company events, as if everything was exactly where it should be. Because deep down, I wanted to believe that. Because there was no room for failure in that kind of carefully constructed happiness. And it was at that exact point, between apparent certainties and silent doubts, that everything began to change. Almost imperceptibly, like a thin crack that runs through a perfect wall. First there are small miscommunications, then unshared decisions, then absences disguised as commitments. And, finally, that feeling that, even when sleeping in the same bed, the worlds no longer touch with the same completeness as before. But nobody knew. Nobody saw. And maybe they didn't even know it yet. And it is at this exact moment that the story begins. Because what comes next will change both of their lives forever. And it will show, with surgical precision, how even the most solid loves can crumble when silence becomes stronger than the truth. The reunion between Laura and Thomas, which at first seemed just a coincidence, gradually became an increasingly constant, albeit subtle, presence. At first, sporadic exchanges of messages, always polite, always cordial, without an overtly inappropriate tone. They talked about art, about the changes in the city, about people in common. Laura didn't see the harm in that. Or maybe I just chose not to see it. Thomas was part of a distant past, closed long ago, and Daniel, in his calm security, had never shown jealousy or distrust. It was easy, even comfortable, to maintain that contact on the sidelines of your life. But what seemed harmless began to take up too much space. One coffee, then another. A call at night, under the pretext of a professional question. An invitation to a lecture. Little things. Small deviations. Nothing that could be considered treason. Yet. Over time, Laura realized that there was something about Thomas that made her feel alive in a different way. Not safer, not more protected, but desired. And that desire, so different from the serene love she shared with Daniel, teased her like a mirror that revealed parts of herself she had already forgotten. With Thomas, she laughed louder, spoke faster, gestured more freely. It was another. Or maybe it was just the old version of herself, being reborn between the cracks of a routine that had numbed her instincts. And that confused her. It divided her. I tried to go home and be the same as before, with the same lightness, the same rituals. But something inside her was shifting. An annoyance, an uneasiness that I couldn't name. And Daniel, attentive as always, began to notice. He was never the controlling type, never questioned your schedule or asked for cell phone passwords. But her look had changed. Response time in conversations. The subtle absence in simple moments. Daniel felt, even without proof, that something was slipping out of his hands. He began to observe her in silence, trying to make sense of what was becoming increasingly confusing. Laura still kissed him affectionately, still hugged him at night, but there was a distance in her touch, a shift in her gaze, a tiredness disguised as haste. And for the first time in years, he felt afraid. A fear that hurt more due to the lack of confrontation than the real threat. Because, at that moment, there were no screams, no arguments, no betrayals discovered. There was only emptiness. And the silence. Laura, in turn, started to live in two worlds. The first was what she kept with Daniel, made up of affection, history, memories. The second, more recent, was the one born next to Thomas, made of intensity, promises and illusions. And the closer he got to the second, the more he felt the weight of betraying the first. However, he couldn't stop. Not out of malice. But out of weakness. Out of a desire that mixed guilt and pleasure, and that made her feel that she was still young, still desirable, still someone outside the role of an exemplary wife. He began to lie, albeit gently. Hiding details. Deleting messages. Skipping meetings. And deep down, I knew I had already crossed the line. Thomas, on the other hand, knew exactly what he was doing. Unlike Laura, he carried no guilt. On the contrary. There was a calculated precision in his every movement. He didn't press, he didn't charge, but he didn't back down either. He knew the right moment to appear, to disappear, to provoke. It was as if he was building something that went beyond desire. And Laura, deceived by this control disguised as kindness, began to surrender. First emotionally. Then physically. The first time happened late in the afternoon, in a studio hidden in the back of an art gallery. It was raining heavily outside, and she had just stopped by to see a new exhibition. Thomas appeared by surprise. He had damp hair, a book in his hands and that smile that she was beginning to fear. They talked about a contemporary artist, about the symbolism of loneliness in the lines on the canvas, and when he touched her arm, it was as if all the tension she carried collapsed. The kiss happened without words. And the rest was as quick as it was inevitable. That night, upon returning home, Laura cried in the bathroom with the door locked, the shower running, hiding her sobs. She felt dirty, regretful, but also alive in a cruel way. And he didn't tell anyone. Not even for herself. Daniel, increasingly restless, began to investigate in silence. Not because I wanted to catch her, but because I needed to understand what was happening. He began to notice the schedules, the clothes, the absences. He discovered that she frequented places that she no longer mentioned. He found a torn note in the trash, with a number that wasn't his. And then one night he took her cell phone while she was sleeping. The heart was racing, the hands were shaking, the code was discovered without difficulty. And there were the messages. The audios. The photos. All. It wasn't the content itself that hurt him most. It was the way she showed herself different. It was Laura he no longer knew. The tone of voice, the laughter, the nicknames, the silences that now made sense. Read, reread, listen. And he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He didn't scream. Didn't wake up. It didn't destroy anything. He just left the room and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, trying to understand where all this had started. The next day, he acted normally. He prepared coffee, kissed her on the forehead, and wished her a good day. But inside him, something had died. And something new had been born. In the days that followed, Daniel changed. He became more observant, more introspective, but also more calculating. He began to build, in silence, the plan that would put an end to that farce. Not out of immediate revenge, but out of self-respect. I knew there was no going back. And he decided that, when the right time came, he would put an end to it. But with dignity. No scandals. No screaming. Only with the truth exposed in the clearest and most indisputable way possible. And this moment came unexpectedly, at a charity event organized by one of the companies where Laura worked. A luxurious ballroom, live music, elegant guests, golden lights reflected in champagne glasses. Laura had insisted that he go. I needed to keep up appearances. And Daniel accepted, with the serenity of someone who knows exactly what he is about to do. He put on his black suit, adjusted his shirt cuffs, and put on the leather watch that she had given him on their 5th wedding anniversary. And left. Their entry into the hall was noticed. They still looked like the perfect couple. Laura was smiling, Daniel kept his gaze steady, his posture impeccable. They talked to acquaintances, toasted, laughed. But he knew. And she doesn't. Yet. And that's when Thomas appeared. In a gray suit, well-groomed beard, the same rehearsed smile. He approached naturally, as if greeting an old friend. And Laura froze for a moment. She tried to hide it, but Daniel noticed the tremor in her eyes. Thomas greeted her with 2 kisses on the cheek, and then suggested that they go and talk in a quieter corner. She hesitated. Daniel nodded, with a slight smile. Go, he said. And she went. He walked alongside Thomas through the room, passing through people, lights and soundtracks. When they reached the side of the room, he pulled her with a quick gesture, and she let herself be led. They talked quietly, laughed, exchanging words that seemed too intimate for that place. And it was then that Daniel followed them. He stopped a few meters away, watching. His impassive face. His eyes fixed on her. And, at that moment, like a theater in slow motion, everything was revealed. Laura saw him. Their eyes met. And she understood. Her smile died on her face. Daniel walked towards them, taking his time. He stopped in front of the two. The silence that fell was absolute. And then he said, without raising his tone, but with the firmness of someone who no longer has anything to lose, why did you decide to go with this guy? You will now live with him, and no longer with me. It's all over between us. And before any response could be articulated, he turned and left. No rush. Without looking back. The hall fell silent. The looks turned. And Laura stayed there, standing next to Thomas, with her soul falling apart into pieces that no one could pick up. But what she still didn't know, was that that night was just beginning. And the real reason behind everything that happened was yet to be revealed. After the night in the hall, nothing returned to its place. The news of the divorce spread like fire on thin paper, among colleagues, mutual friends, surprised family members and discreet neighbors who, now, watched with disguised pity. Laura disappeared for days. He called Daniel repeatedly, but there was no response. He sent messages, tried to justify, tried to ask for forgiveness, but all he received was silence. A heavy, absolute silence, as if he had ripped from his soul any trace of what he once felt for her. The house was empty when he returned to get some things. He had removed the clothes, the photos, the souvenirs. Even the plants were gone. There was nothing there that still connected her to him. It was as if it had been erased. And in a way, it had been. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed the opposite. He exuded a cool confidence, as if everything had gone according to plan. He opened his arms to welcome her, offered shelter, comfort, promises of a future together. Laura, although confused, felt like she had no other way. I was ashamed of everything. Herself. Sometimes, when he looked at his own reflection, he barely recognized himself. And yet, she immersed herself in that new reality, determined to rebuild her own life alongside the person who, until then, seemed to be the only one offering her a helping hand. In the first few weeks, Thomas was helpful, loving, attentive. He bought flowers, took her to discreet dinners, sent messages in the middle of the day with sweet words, made plans, talked about trips, opportunities, investments. He suggested that they join forces to open something together, something innovative, promising, a proposal to get out of the emotional and financial hole that the scandal had caused. Laura, vulnerable and thirsty for something that would make her feel useful and alive, accepted without hesitation. He invested money that he had saved from his mother's inheritance, withdrew funds from investments, sold the car, took the name off the old apartment and transferred everything to his new life with Thomas. I trusted him, or wanted to trust him. I would rather hold on to this new version of the future than face my own guilt in the mirror. The months that followed were full of effort and dedication. Laura immersed herself in the project, studying, planning, making contacts. Thomas, always present, came and went, saying he would take care of the legal part, the contracts, the partners. He said he was talking to investors, lawyers, potential clients. She didn't suspect it. I wanted to believe that, for the first time, something new was being born there. The previous failure, she explained to herself, was the result of an empty relationship. Not now. Now she was with someone who fought with her, for her. But the first signs began to appear. Small delays from Thomas, calls that he answered far away, documents that never arrived, bills that started to be late, emails that were ignored. Laura questioned and received cold answers, well-articulated excuses, cynical smiles disguised as patience. I didn't want to see. But he started to see. And when his name disappeared from social media, when the phone went straight to voicemail and contacts with those investors turned out to be non-existent, something inside her finally broke. He went to the bank. He discovered that the joint account had been emptied. He tried to track the latest movements, but the manager just repeated that, as he was the main account holder, she was not authorized to reveal details. He returned to the office, or rather, to the rented room that was now empty. Thomas wasn't there. Nobody knew about him. He called mutual friends, longtime acquaintances, but no one had any information. And then he understood. Not only had she been betrayed by Daniel in the past that she considered distant, but now she had been deceived, used, emptied by someone she herself chose to put in the place of the man she destroyed. The irony was unbearable. Not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go, he decided on the only thing he could do, face Daniel. Maybe out of pride. Perhaps out of desperation. Maybe because, even without having that right, she needed to be heard. And it was. Found him in a small cafe where he used to work on Saturdays. Came in unannounced. He caught a glimpse of her and looked back at his notebook. She sat in front of him, her eyes teary. He didn't say anything. The pen was still between his fingers, but it no longer moved. Laura started to speak. He told everything. The relationship with Thomas, the investment, the scam, the escape. He spoke with raw honesty, but without seeking pity. I didn't cry anymore. He spoke angrily. Anger at yourself. Of what he had done. From where he had placed himself. Daniel listened to her in silence, looking at her as if observing something that has already died and still doesn't know. When she finished, Laura took a deep breath and said she just wanted him to know. That I wasn't there to apologize or forgive. He just needed someone, him, to listen. Daniel then closed the notebook, pushed the cup to the side and finally spoke. The voice was low but firm. He said he didn't feel pleasure seeing her like that. That there was no joy in his pain. But all of that only confirmed what he always suspected, that Thomas wasn't there out of love. I was looking for something much deeper. And she said there was something she didn't know yet. Something she needed to hear, even if it destroyed her completely. She looked at him with a mix of fear and defiance. And then, Daniel revealed. Thomas had not returned by chance. He had engineered everything. From the first coffee, from the first message. Thomas had lost everything because of Laura. Years ago, she anonymously reported him for an ethical breach within the company where they worked together. The scandal ruined his career. There was no arrest, but the reputation was pulverized. Nobody else wanted to hire him. The investigation did not find concrete evidence, but the stain remained. Thomas, who until then was a promising name, was reduced to anonymity. And he always knew it was her. Because of a comment, an access that only she had, a sequence of attitudes that coincided too much. He tried to confront her at that time, but she vehemently denied it. He said he didn't know anything. And he swallowed it like poison. Daniel then said that he discovered all this after the divorce, when a former colleague of Thomas's approached him. He said Thomas had told him his plan. That he had returned only to ruin Laura. Not for money. But out of pride. For revenge. It was personal. And it worked. The silence that followed was piercing. Laura, astonished, didn't know what to say. His eyes were filling again, but not with ordinary tears. It was despair. It was shame in its raw form. Daniel, seeing her expression, only whispered that she had dug her own ruin with her own hands. He didn't need him to punish himself anymore. And he got up. Before leaving, he left an envelope on the table. Inside was a copy of the dossier that confirmed everything. She stayed there for long minutes, without the strength to open, but knowing that there was the final nail in her emotional coffin. The woman who was once admired, loved, desired, now found herself alone, betrayed, used and destroyed by her own choices. And for the first time, he was fully aware of what he had done. And the price you would pay. Because even if Thomas left, even if the money came back, even if she rebuilt everything, she would never be who she once was. And nothing, absolutely nothing, of what she had with Daniel, could be restored. She had been betrayed. Yes. But before that, she had betrayed herself. And now, there were no more mirrors to hide in. Laura remained there, static, staring at the envelope as if it could somehow erase the weight that was beginning to consume everything around her. Outside, people passed by, talking, laughing, carrying shopping bags, hugging, quick kisses on busy sidewalks, while inside a silent collapse took place. Finally, he took the envelope with trembling fingers, opened it with almost ceremonial care and saw the evidence, documents, printouts of messages, audio recordings between Thomas and a former acquaintance, dates, details, even receipts. He had planned every step. She read it all, once, then again. The words started to get jumbled. Thomas's face appeared in her mind not as the man who enveloped her with promises, but as the calculating executioner who led her into the abyss itself. The pieces began to fall into place cruelly. Every absence of his, every cold gesture camouflaged with affection, every moment she blamed herself for being paranoid. Everything made sense. And, worse, she knew she deserved a lot of it. On the way home, Laura drove aimlessly, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were her only link to reality. I wanted to scream, break something, run away. But there was nowhere else to run. Arriving home, the silence of the rented apartment echoed an even greater emptiness. She threw her bag on the sofa, dropped her papers on the table and went straight to her room. He took a quick shower, not to relax, but as a transition ritual between ignorance and lucidity. When he left, he came across the mirror. He looked at himself with a contempt he had never felt. Not for betrayal, not for abandonment, but for having been naive, stupid, blind enough to repeat the same mistakes, and, worse, with someone she had ruined by choice. Now she was the one destroyed. He spent the next few days dragging himself along between failed attempts to react and silent relapses on the couch, without eating properly, without answering calls, without responding to messages. He lost weight, lost the little hope he still had of rebuilding himself. Until one day, in the middle of a rainy morning, his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated, thought about ignoring it, but answered. It was a woman. Her voice was firm, polite, but direct. He said he needed to talk to Laura personally about Thomas. He insisted it was urgent. He arranged a meeting at a discreet, out-of-the-way restaurant in the late afternoon. Laura arrived first, just ordered some tea and stood there, waiting, with anxiety eating away at her nails between warm sips. When the woman arrived, she surprised Laura. Young, elegant, confident posture. She introduced herself as Isadora. And, bluntly, he delivered the final bombshell. Isadora was Thomas's wife. Officially married to him for 7 years. They had a 4-year-old daughter. And she knew about the betrayal. Not just with Laura, but with other women. Thomas was an emotional predator. He seduced, manipulated, exploited. Isadora, for a long time, pretended not to know. Until he discovered that Laura had lost everything. That's when she decided to act. Laura felt her stomach turn. The idea that Thomas could have a structured parallel life, a young daughter, a house with another woman while infiltrating her life with promises and speeches about starting over, was more than she could process. Isadora continued, now with a more personal tone. He said he believed for a long time that he could change Thomas. That he was just a wounded man trying to find a new chance. But after his daughter started asking why her father always disappeared on the weekends, she realized something more serious was going on. Investigated. Discovered everything. And when he found out about the coup against Laura, he understood that he could no longer protect that man. Laura heard everything with a mixture of disgust and gratitude. Isadora, without knowing it, had offered him something that not even Daniel could, a real end. One last piece of that grotesque puzzle that was now finally complete. The woman held out a folder with copies of documents and contacts. He said that Laura could use it however she wanted, go to the police, file a civil lawsuit, look for what was still possible to recover. But Laura didn't want more money, nor judicial justice. What I wanted was emotional justice. She looked at Isadora and said, in a low but firm voice, that the only thing that still sustained her was the knowledge that Thomas would lose, one by one, all the faces he manipulated. And that she, Laura, was willing to guarantee that. The next day, Laura went to Thomas's old house, the same one where she spent a few nights believing she was building something new. The doorbell rang. The one who answered was a waitress, who recognized Laura, hesitated, but let her in. The house was empty, strangely organized, as if no one actually lived there. Waited for over an hour. When Thomas arrived, the surprise on his face wasn't guilt or remorse. It was contempt. Cold. As if she were just another page turned. Laura, for the first time ever, maintained control. He said he knew about Isadora, his daughter, the other women, the coup. He said he wasn't there to beg, nor to cry. I was there to stare. He asked how he slept at night. How he could face his own reflection. And he laughed. A low, almost mocking laugh. Said she was easy. That from the first coffee, I knew I would have it. That she was so desperate for attention that she would do anything to feel wanted again. Laura wanted to hit him. But he didn't. She just looked into his eyes and said he was smaller than she imagined. And that, even if he lost everything, he would never have to carry what he carried inside his chest. He, once again, laughed. He said that the world does not work with moral metrics. He said she was a useful asset. But now it was useless. Laura left there with teary eyes, but not from pain. It was indignation. It was contempt. It was strength. And for the first time in months, he felt upright. He went home, tore up the last photos, blocked numbers, deleted emails. She began looking for work in new areas, accepting a smaller position, but one that kept her busy. He went to therapy. He reconnected with people who had grown apart. He rebuilt himself, not as he was before, but as he could be now. One night, alone, going through old files on the computer, she found a folder with photos from a trip she and Daniel took years ago. He smiled lightly, like someone carrying no weight. She saw herself younger, simpler. He smiled back at the screen. And at that moment, by impulse or destiny, she wrote to him. A single message. No requests, no justifications. Just a thank you. For history, for years, for pain. Because, in some way, he had been the starting point of a reconstruction that she would never have started alone. On the other side, Daniel read the message hours later. He was in a restaurant with a woman with calm eyes and a firm voice, someone he had met at a lecture weeks before. When she read Laura's message, she smiled with her eyes downcast. He didn't respond. It just turned off. And he looked again at the woman in front of him, who was talking about books, about cinema, about the fear of starting over. And Daniel, at that moment, knew he was ready. Because, no matter how much the past had left its mark, he still believed in the future. And on the other side of the city, in a small room, Laura looked at the dark ceiling and breathed slowly. I knew that starting over wouldn't erase the pain, but it gave me the chance to learn to live with it. And that, now, was enough. The days that followed the final meeting with Thomas were filled with a silent exhaustion that seemed to permeate Laura's every gesture. There was no more room for despair, nor for illusions. There was only the concreteness of everything that had happened and the bitter realization that, even after having lost everything, she still needed to learn to survive with her own choices. Time no longer passed at a fast pace, but it didn't drag on either. It was an irregular rhythm of attempts, of broken desires and rebuilt with the little that was left. Every morning was a coping exercise. Open your eyes, get out of bed, choose clothes that don't carry memories, go out on the streets pretending to be a person who still knew what they wanted in life. There was a strange mixture of resistance and resignation in her. He no longer sought justice or redemption. He was just looking for dignity. The chance not to sink even deeper into the depths she dug herself. The temporary job he had gotten at a small publishing house became his new anchor. It was simple, routine, nothing like what I had done before, but it was enough to occupy my mind and maintain some financial flow that would prevent total collapse. He avoided large social circles, barely responded to messages that weren't urgent, and, when someone from his past dared to start a conversation, he maintained a polite coldness, as if he no longer allowed himself to live with judgment disguised as empathy. She had severed almost all the ties that linked her to her previous life. She changed address, left the rented apartment and went to a smaller, more distant studio, where no one recognized her. He created a silent world, without too many mirrors, without framed memories. He just wanted to rebuild himself, but without going back to who he was. Above all, she wanted not to become bitter. However, even with all the efforts, there was a wound that remained open, the relationship with his parents, broken since the divorce scandal. Laura had walked away from them when she realized that pride was the only shield she had left, and dealing with her mother's disappointed look was more unbearable than any abandonment. The father, more silent, had just withdrawn, without confrontations, without phone calls, without attempts to get closer. For months, there was no contact. But when she found old correspondence stored in boxes during the move, something inside her broke again. She remembered the letters her father wrote to her as a teenager, the way he always told her that no matter what she did, he would be there. And, at that moment, he realized that perhaps there was still something to rescue. He decided to go to their house unannounced. He walked slowly to the gate, looking at the familiar garden that had changed little, and smelled the familiar smell of the lemon tree that always bloomed in front of the porch. He rang the doorbell and waited. Mom, when she opened the door, took a few seconds to recognize her. The silence between the two was more eloquent than any hug. Laura asked to come in. He sat on the sofa where he had lain down so many times to tell stories of love and plans. The mother said nothing. He served tea, as he always did, and sat down in the armchair opposite. It was Laura who spoke. He didn't apologize, he didn't justify himself, he just told the truth with the crudity of someone who no longer has the strength to lie. He talked about Thomas, the blow, the emotional ruin. Her mother listened to her, without interrupting. When he finished, her eyes were teary, but there was no anger, just sadness. A sadness that didn't judge, that didn't accuse, just lamented. And then he said that, even though everything had been destroyed, she was still her daughter. And daughters don't stop being daughters when they make mistakes, they just need more love. Her father entered the room minutes later, his hair whiter than Laura remembered. He knelt before her and held her hands tightly. He said he had been waiting for that day since the silence of the first ignored phone call. And that no matter how long it took, he knew she would come back. Laura collapsed. He cried like he hadn't cried since the end of everything. And there, in the midst of what was left of her roots, she realized that perhaps there were still places where it was possible to start over without hiding. In the following weeks, she started visiting her parents on Sundays, having dinner with them, laughing at the little things, relearning how to be among people who knew her before everything, before the mistake, before the guilt. This reconnection with his origins brought an unexpected lightness. He started writing. Small texts. Reflections. Short stories that mixed reality with fantasy. The publisher where I worked started publishing some in a weekly column. And, little by little, Laura regained a part of herself that she didn't know, the woman who creates, who transforms pain into narrative, who survives not through denial, but through reinvention. On the other side of this story, Daniel followed his own path. After finishing the cycle with Laura, he immersed himself in his work with more intensity. He started speaking, was invited to lead a project in another city, traveled, met new people. The woman he had dinner with that night at the cafe became a constant presence. Her name was Clara. He had a calmness that contrasted with the intensity he had carried since the divorce. Little by little, she entered his life without invading. He accompanied his pain with listening, not in a hurry. Daniel, at first, resisted. I was afraid of repeating stories, of trusting, of loving. But Clara, patient, stayed. He didn't ask for guarantees. Just presence. And he, even without realizing it, allowed himself to stay too. One day, at a photography exhibition, Daniel saw a painting that paralyzed him. It was an image of a woman in the middle of a crowd, her gaze distant, as if she was looking for something impossible. The caption said, "What remains when love leaves is not emptiness, it is memory." He stood there, absorbing every inch of that image, feeling, for the first time in a long time, that he had finally let go of the last thread that still connected him to the past. He looked at Clara, who was watching him from a distance, and smiled sincerely. It was like breathing after being trapped underwater for too long. Meanwhile, Laura received an unexpected proposal. A small documentary production company wanted to turn its chronicles into a streaming series. At first he hesitated. Exposing her pain, even fictionally, required courage. But he ended up accepting. He rewrote stories, adjusted characters, changed names. He inserted nuances and metaphors that only those who lived would know how to decipher. It was his way of telling what he experienced without needing to justify himself. And, when he saw the first episode ready, he felt proud. For the first time, her pain was transformed into art. Despite her apparent stability, there was still a moral dilemma within her that presented itself whenever she put her head on the pillow. Would it be possible to rebuild oneself without carrying guilt forever? To what extent does one mistake define an entire life? The betrayal, the delivery to the wrong man, the destruction of everything that had been built, all of this still echoed in his choices. On longer nights, he questioned whether he really deserved to start over. If the forgiveness she had received from her parents, from her few remaining friends, and from herself, was real or just a disguise so she could continue living. It was in these moments that I wrote in more depth. That his chronicles gained more intensity. Because it was in the shadows that his writing flourished. One afternoon, as she was leaving the publishing house, Laura came across a figure she hadn't seen for a long time. Clara. Yes, Daniel's new companion. They were in a nearby coffee shop and, by some cruel coincidence or subtle providence, they ended up face to face. There was an awkward silence, but Clara, with unshakable serenity, smiled and motioned for her to sit down. Laura, surprised, accepted. During the conversation, Clara did not ask about the past. He spoke about Laura's texts, about how much he connected with her words. She said that Daniel had read some, without knowing they were hers. And when he found out, he didn't comment. Just kept it. Laura didn't know what to say. Clara then said something that would remain in her memory forever, that sometimes love doesn't need to continue to be eternal. That certain stories, even when finished, leave marks that should not be erased. And perhaps the greatest challenge is not to forget, but to live with what we were without hindering what we can still be. Laura left that cafe with a light heart. For the first time, he felt like he no longer needed to hide from anyone. Not even Daniel. Not even Clara. Not even from you. It was alive. And although the drive there had been brutal, she knew she had crossed the darkest part of the road. And now, ahead, something new was finally beginning to emerge. But what would come next, she still didn't know. What she knew for sure was that she was ready to live without hiding. And that the pain, although still pulsating, was no longer a prison. It was now just part of the landscape that made it whole. The meeting with Clara reverberated in Laura as a last sign that the cycle was truly closing. There was no anger, there was no hurt, there was no jealousy. There was something rarer, more mature, recognition. She recognized in Clara the woman she once was alongside Daniel, and also saw in her the reflection of what she wanted to become. Someone who chooses to love lightly, someone who walks without rushing, someone who understands the pain of others without letting themselves be contaminated by it. In the following days, Laura found herself thinking about the naturalness of that meeting, the serenity that Clara's eyes carried, as if she had made peace with all the ghosts that could exist there. That was what marked her most, the absence of war. Clara didn't confront her, didn't seek answers, didn't ask for explanations. She just offered the space for the truth to exist between them without needing to be discussed. And that, more than any judgment, gave Laura the final permission to leave the past where it belonged. The recordings of the series based on his chronicles were progressing. Laura participated closely, not only in the scriptwriting, but in discussions with actors, directors and screenwriters. The project gained shape and strength. Her name began to be mentioned in articles, in debates about contemporary literature, at events for emerging writers. He started receiving invitations for interviews, lectures and fairs. Little by little, the woman who had lost herself amid impulsive decisions and destructive loves began to be known for her voice, and no longer for her pain. But with that also came responsibility. Some people who read his texts, even without knowing the story behind them, saw themselves in them with a disturbing depth. They started writing to her, telling her about their own experiences, betrayals, new beginnings, anguish. And Laura, without expecting it, found herself in the role of listening to the other with empathy, even when everything about her was still bleeding in silence. It was on one of those nights, answering messages until late, that he received an unexpected email. The sender was a well-known name. Isadora. Thomas's wife. Laura hesitated before opening it. He had completely moved away from that past. Since handing over all the documents to the police, he decided not to follow the process. I didn't want to know where he was, what happened to the money, whether he would be arrested or just disappear forever. I just wanted to not carry that weight anymore. But Isadora seemed to have another need. In the email, it said that the trial was scheduled and that Thomas would be charged with embezzlement, misrepresentation and embezzlement. That other women had emerged, that the reports were multiplying, and that the impact of the case took on unexpected proportions. Isadora delicately asked Laura to give a statement. Not just as a witness, but as someone who could stop others from being dragged into the same hole. She didn't pressure, she just explained the context. Laura spent the night awake. He walked from one side to the other of the small apartment, his head immersed in memories he would rather forget. I didn't want to relive it all out loud, I didn't want to sit in front of strangers and be questioned, exposed, judged. But there was something about that request that wasn't just about justice, it was about liberation. It was about finally putting an end to it. The next day, he called Isadora. They said few words. They scheduled the meeting in a neutral place. When they saw each other, Laura noticed that Isadora was thinner, more tired, but still with that determined look. She thanked Laura for her availability, said that she understood if she gave up, but that she wanted her to know that her testimony could be decisive. Laura confirmed she would be there. She knew she owed it not only to the other victims, but to herself. And I also knew that this would be the last real chapter of the story with Thomas. At the hearing, he sat in front of judges, prosecutors, lawyers and strangers with his heart beating in a painful rhythm. But as she began to speak, something aligned inside her. He told every detail, without flourishes, without dramatization. He spoke about the meetings, the investments, the scam, the manipulation. He felt the eyes turn, he felt the whispers. But it didn't stop. When he finished, he looked across the room at Thomas. He didn't seem shaken. His face remained the same, hard, cold, calculated. But his eyes, for the first time, trembled. It was there, at that moment, that he realized he had lost control of the narrative. That the voices of the women he had subjugated now formed a chorus stronger than his manipulation. Laura left the room with lighter shoulders. And that same day, for the first time, he slept soundly without needing medication. Months later, the process ended. Thomas was convicted. Reduced sentence, like so many similar cases. But what mattered was that his name was exposed. That your reputation wouldn't hold up. That he could no longer hide behind smiles, fake contracts, or empty promises. Laura could now live without that weight. The past had been returned to its place of origin, in memories, and no longer in routine. With the end of the trial, the series based on his texts was released. The impact was above expectations. She received praise, awards and was invited to international festivals. But, strangely enough, that wasn't what made her smile. What moved her were the anonymous testimonials, the messages from ordinary women, who said they felt seen, understood, welcomed. Those words made her understand that her story, however painful it was, had turned into something useful. That his fall had become an impetus for others to rise. An invitation then arrived. An event about literature and emotional justice. It would be a table with other writers and psychologists. The theme, love, guilt and reconstruction. Accepted. I wanted to end that cycle in a symbolic way. On the day of the event, she wore simple clothes, light makeup, but she looked beautiful. Not an aesthetic beauty. It was the beauty of someone who went through the storm and still carries dignity on their face. He spoke with courage, answered difficult questions, faced critical looks. And, at the end, someone from the audience asked to speak. It was Daniel. He stood up and, with a firm voice, publicly thanked her for transforming her pain into words. He said that although the past between them was over, he still deeply respected the woman she had become. The auditorium fell silent. Laura smiled with her eyes. And he responded with something that was not in the papers: pain, when it is not buried, can teach us to take better care of others. But only when we accept it as part of who we are, and not as a sentence of what we deserve. That night, she left the event alone, but with the feeling of no longer being incomplete. He had come too far to continue defining himself by what he lost. Now it was what he rebuilt. And even if many wounds did not heal completely, they would stop hurting over time. Because she had something bigger than guilt, the truth. And this truth, even bitter, freed. The world wasn't fair. Time didn't heal everything. But some choices, even late ones, can still change destinies. And Laura, now, knew it with every fiber of her being. There was still a lot to live for. And this time, she wouldn't run. I would just walk. Step by step. At the right time. No rush. No hiding places. No fear. In the months following the repercussions of the series and her last public appearance alongside writers and experts, Laura became a solid name in literary and social circles that previously seemed distant from her reality. She, who for so long walked in the shadow of wrong choices, was now called to talk about resilience, about identity, about the complexity of human affections. But unlike before, I didn't accept everything. He turned down invitations that seemed more interested in controversy than transformation. She carefully chose the spaces she wanted to occupy, the stages where she wanted to leave her word, not as a survivor, but as a woman aware of the weight of each step she took. The wound no longer bled, but it still pulsed as the silence of the night enveloped it. Sometimes I dreamed of voices, of dark rooms, of cold touches. She woke up sweating, breathing deeply, reminding herself that she wasn't there anymore. That past was behind us. But it was a past that, despite being distant, still formed part of what she was. And she never wanted to forget him. I just wanted to know how to live together. It was in this range of new possibilities that an unexpected proposal to teach as a guest teacher in a creative writing course aimed at women in vulnerable situations emerged. It was a social initiative, discreet, without media, without prestige. But Laura accepted without hesitation. There, he met women who carried similar wounds, scars that were also intertwined with power relationships, long silences, stories of betrayals that were much deeper than those of love. They came from all corners, with all the colors and sounds of pain, and each class became an act of collective healing. Laura found a new meaning there. He didn't just tell his story. Now, she helped other women tell theirs. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his journey with a kind of peace that no longer sought to make noise. Clara became his life partner, not just in everyday gestures, but in projects, in ideas, in the shared silence of the nights when they both just read on the couch, side by side. They got married in an intimate ceremony, without fanfare, surrounded by people who understood that love is not born from forgetting, but from the daily choice to start over without the chains of the past. Daniel never sought to know what Laura was doing, but, occasionally, he read her texts published in columns that crossed his path. And whenever he finished a paragraph, he let out a silent, almost imperceptible sigh, as if he recognized between the lines the woman he once loved and who, in some way, still respected. Thomas, on the other hand, reaped what he sowed. After his conviction, he became a cursed name in corporate circles. He tried to open companies in other states using pseudonyms, he tried to invest in parallel markets, but he was always discovered. A destroyed reputation does not find a foundation to rebuild anything solid. He became a ghostly figure, someone who wandered between desperate attempts to manipulate new victims and resounding failures. He couldn't settle down, he couldn't create roots, he couldn't maintain ties. It was as if every person who approached him recognized the scent of lies permeated on his skin. He ended up being arrested again, not for a grand scam, but for a pathetic attempt at embezzlement in a small town where no one cared for his cheap charm. He grew old before his time, his once calculating eyes now carried despair. The predator had become its own prey, and there was no one left to save it. Isadora, the woman who was once also a victim and accomplice, found her own way. She decided to move to another city with her young daughter, opened a small literary cafe and created a space where women could find support, information and sincere exchanges. He sent a last message to Laura, thanking her for her courage, for her voice, for her choice not to remain silent. And he said that he now understood that self-love is not born when someone values us, but when we choose to no longer accept being diminished. Laura, now far from the emotional confusion that defined her for so long, lived years of silent construction. He wrote 2 books, both fictional, but full of the reality he knew firsthand. One of them was translated into other languages and won modest but impactful awards. I never wanted to become a celebrity, nor be a symbol of overcoming. He just wanted his words to reach those who needed them. The money came back, but it no longer defined her. He invested wisely, shared with social projects, traveled to places where no one knew his name, just to breathe other air and remember that life is always broader than any pain. One night, she was invited to participate in a reading circle in the same space where, years before, she had met Thomas. He entered the hall with firm steps, looked around, recognized the paintings, the smell of old wood, the sound of mixed voices. She sat in front of the audience, now not as a spectator, but as an author. He read an excerpt from the new book, where a character said that, after losing everything, he discovered that freedom is what remains when there is nothing left to hide. The audience gave a standing ovation. And, as he left the place, he looked at the sky and took a deep breath. She felt complete. Not because she won, but because she survived without becoming what destroyed her. The next morning, he woke up with a new idea for a script, put on the coffee, turned on the computer and, when he opened the screen, smiled. There was no one to impress, no eyes to win. He wrote for himself, for the girl who believed in love, for the woman who believed in lies, and for the survivor who now knew that betrayals are just turning points, not eternal definitions. And so this story ends. A story of love, fall, pain, and rebirth. Where each character received what their choices deserved. Where love did not win in the traditional format, but transformed into something more powerful, acceptance. The conscience. The liberation. If you made it this far, comment what you thought of this story. We really want to know your opinion. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and follow other stories like this. Here, we tell stories that move, transform and, above all, make us reflect. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our mission is to show, through fiction, how wrong choices can ruin real lives. Until next time.